the way in which I'm going to present my talk first, unfortunately, I'm going to talk a little bit about that last trend because I realized as Jérôme was presenting that indeed it is perhaps the more relevant than the one that I originally prepared. So it's going to be a mix of methods, but also a bit of reflection, continuing that reflection about the notion of technology. So first of all, for those of you who don't know it, I've been trained in France, or partially in Britain and France. I've been, I'm a stranger in every places. And coming from France, there is a francophone tradition of anthropology, which is called la technologie culturelle, cultural technology, which is a very interesting term and completely misleading for anyone who is Anglophone. Because in that iteration that was developed in 1960s and 70s in the wake of Marcel Mauss' tradition, André-Georges Audricourt, André Leroy-Gourand, and Pierre Lemonnier, that I'm sure some of you have known, and also under the influence of Maurice Godelier when he was a hardcore Marxist, developed that, and with an American researcher called Robert Cresswell, they developed that strand of anthropology before the term material culture was really sort of in fashion. And they wanted to do to techniques what anthropology has done to be human. So that is that for them, la technologie culturelle, cultural technology, was to techniques was what anthropology was to the human. That was the cultural study of techniques. And that's a very interesting point, because when I remember when I moved to Britain the first time, when I was writing my PhD, I remember that researcher who asked me what I was focusing on. I said, I focus on technology. And that researcher told me, oh yeah, Foucault, which I found very interesting. He said, no, not Foucault. I'm looking at how people make things, do things, and etc. And I found that this confusion that sort of started me on a path and many discussions with colleagues and misunderstandings and jokes even about the meaning of the term technology. The topic of techniques, what we call technology in British anthropology and American anthropology, is not in itself a new topic, right? You go back to 19th century, a lot of people were looking at mode of subsistence, mode of making. Malinowski himself were looking at gardening practices, right? And interestingly enough, this sort of a topic sort of got diluted at the heyday of when anthropology is starting to look at symbolic systems, at kinship system, and etc., and sort of fell a bit in the background. And you could find all those information in chapters such as mode of subsistence or crafts, or mode of, and for the Marxist influence, mode of production. Interestingly enough, if you look at the Marxist work, even the almost now deified Marshall Salins and its twin god, Godelier, when you look at their work, they rarely pay attention to the way in which people do things. They were more interested in the relations of production, that is the social dimension, the social context in which production practice were sort of deployed. And in a sense, coming to Britain, where in this department particularly, when the emphasis was more on conception and symbolic with the work of Danny Miller and etc., it was a very interesting trajectory for me. It was a bit like being thrown in a domain in which every time I was talking about technology, I could feel a sense for, not everybody, but some of my colleagues. I remember Crispini asking me during my interview, how can you want to do a course on technology? How can you promise us that you are not going to, or what can you tell us that you are not, that's going to convince us that you are not going to transform our students into deterministic, right? Because if there is something that anthropologists hate with a passion, is any form of determinism, and particularly material and determinism. They hate that. So I found that like very, very interesting. And I'm really grateful for all those engagement with many of my colleagues here, because it started first, I focused on techniques, that is the way in which people were doing things. And by being here, I sort of developed the tool. I redeveloped, reframed a classical tool of the French anthropology of techniques, which was developed by ethnographers, but got only used by archaeologists, which is the chaîne opératoire or operational sequence. Interestingly enough, that method has been under violent critique over, and rightly so, even by those users over the year, and particularly in anthropology, because it was representing a sort of linear way of thinking about the way in which people do and make things. Among others, Tim Ingold himself was proposed a very sort of interestingly, very French Bergsonian vision with this élan vital, this life impulse of a way of making things more recently. Interestingly enough, Tim Ingold in the 1990s was very interested in the topic of technology. He wrote some very, very interesting and very powerful paper trying to push, along with other researchers, the topic of technology in the center of our investigation. And one of the last texts he wrote in 2001 was in an introduction, and he said, and I remember that because it's a very important thing, instead of trying to define what technology is, we should look at what technology do. In a sense, what does the concept does? And that was something that I rediscovered later. And I started to think about the ways in which, indeed, and become more and more aware in parallel to my ethnographic work, of which I'm going to talk about a little bit. I started to have my ears sort of ringing every time in the public discourses, in the media, among my colleagues, the term technology was mobilized. And I realized that it was always in a sort of black box. Within the concept of technology, in fact, there was really something interesting. There was something that was transforming, because that's what we're talking about, the knowledge that we were supposed to transcribe from our participants, wherever they were. That's one. The second thing that I started to realize over the last 20 years is the way in which the word technology itself started to diffuse in other languages where it wasn't before. The term technology now is widely used in the Anglophone way in French, in Spanish, in Latin America. I've got a PhD student working on that, in Indonesia even. And there is even a way, a part of it, which is, there's a translation in Japanese. I'm sorry, I don't have all my notes here for different sort of reasons. So I found very interesting how such category is so powerful that it even affected the way in which texts were translated. Michel Foucault never talked about the technology of the self. In French, the text is called Les techniques du soi. Should have been translated the techniques of the self. The same, Bruno Latour was talking about Aramis ou l'amour des techniques. And it became Aramis or the love of technology. And there's countless examples like that. And even Pierre Lemonnier, when he was translating some of his work, he didn't really pay attention to that. And we were talking about, we talked about that several times. And I realized that this category was really sort of doing something to what we're talking about. It was framing its content within a certain utilitarian, that is a means to an end relation between humans and what they wanted to achieve. So that's the first part of of the way in which I wanted to talk about. So in a sense, this idea of technology, I think it's for me, it is more and more obvious that it is a category that damages the ways in which we talk about the phenomena that it is supposed to refer, even in its metaphorical sense. So for example, one of our colleagues talks about, we can talk about technology of imagination, we can talk about all sorts of technologies. By the end of the day, it creates a sort of conceptual black box, which I think is really problematic. More recently, no, not recently, back in going to change discipline, in the history and sociology in STS, but also in the history of technology, there's been a movement ever since the 80s within the Anglophone domain to start to scrutinize that very category. Ruth Oldenziel, who wrote a book in the late 90s, which is called Machine and Man, How Technology Was Made Masculine, is one of the first one really to open up that box and to show how the concept itself was associated with a certain male modernist ways of looking at the relationship between humans, what they do, the instruments, the tools that they are using, and the materials. And it was framed within, of course, a certain conception of industrial progress. That's one. Then secondly, in a little bit later, another sociologist named Leo Marx, no relation with the old Karl, started to also unpack the category of technology and showed how it started to be translated, badly translated, from starting with Johannes Beckmann, that from the 18th century, who was a civil servant of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We started to work to design a way to look at what we would call modes of production and try to design a way to understand them in order to allow civil servants to actually improve the process of production right after the Industrial Revolution. And if you want to know more, I'm not going to go into the entire history, which is indeed very fascinating, but have a look at a book which was published in 2018 by Eric Schatzberg, who really described the history of that concept. While at the end, he came up with a sort of way to redeem the category. I am ferociously against it, as some of my colleagues would say. And simply because there are many different approaches to anthropology. And I feel for myself, or the very definition, but one of the dimensions of anthropology that I really care about is the ethnography, and particularly the ways in which, as we are supposed to give voice to the way in which people do things, think through things also. And that's where I started to talk about more of the last few years of the very strong relations, or the very strong need to think again and again about the relation between vernacular categories, the one that the people in Papua New Guinea, in Africa, the Baya, the Ambulese people are sort of using, and on analytical categories. And what do our analytical categories do? It's not a new thing, in a sense, like the anti-perspectivism thing was actually doing that, right? And even arguably the work of people such as Bruno Latour, indeed, by deconstructing the category of nature, has done a lot of work to de-essentialize that sort of overarching category, and demonstrated, along with Philippe Descola and many others, how that was a really modernist category and hegemonic, and how the problems that it created. We could say the same with the essentialist concept of society that Marilyn Strathern has started to unravel or unpack, talking more about its processual nature, to make a very complicated story long. So we have deconstructed, de-essentialized the concept of nature. We have deconceptualized the concept of society. Interestingly enough, there is something in the middle that we haven't deconstructed, and that's technology. And I think that's one of the aim of the 21st century, particularly because the way in which technology in itself is conceived is actually, that plays a very important role in the way in which public policies wants to react to issues such as climate change, or the destruction of the environment, or indeed the gestion or the management of a pandemic, of a border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, not Southern. So I think here there is something that for anthropologists we need to do. So I don't have much time, do I?
No, you don't.
Okay, good. So I'm going to conclude here, and I'm happy to respond to some question about that. The way in which I started to try to unpack that is by simply going back to the ethnography and just saying that what is very interesting in what we call technology or techniques is in fact composed of three different collectives, if you want to use that terms, that are in relation. You've got the human beings and their gestures and their body and their know-how. And you've got, on the other side, a sort of milieu in which we can put the social, the natural, whatever we want to to talk about. And in between, we've got a sort of coupling, which is very interesting, which is indeed all the equipment of tools, of instruments. And that, I think, by looking at those three relations, we can see how the relationship between people and their tools and their instruments and their machine. I've written a paper recently on the printer, on our collective printer in our department, which was more like, you know, a sort of a wink and humoristic, to demonstrate how, starting from looking at that particular interaction between an individual and a network printer, you could actually map out the whole range. I'm talking here, not metaphorically, really clearly, a whole range of relations. In a sense, that led me to suggest that what we call techniques or technical processes and technical activities are simply social relation in another form that includes human and non-humans and their articulation. And I'm going to stop there. So I didn't have any PowerPoint. Sorry.